we're reading Ruth 4, 1 through 18. I'm going to attempt 18 because it's a bunch of names. And Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the next of kin of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the next of kin, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land which belonged to our kinsman Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one beside you to redeem it, and I come after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." Then Boaz said, "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you are also buying Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of the dead, in order to restore the name of the dead to his inheritance." Then the next of kin said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it." Now this was the custom in the former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other. And this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the next of kin said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," and he drew off his sandal, then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. And also Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brethren and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together build up the house of Israel. May you prosper in Ephratah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah because of the children that the Lord will give you by this young woman." So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without next of kin, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the descendants of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron, Hezron of Ram, Ram of Amminadab, Amminadab of Nahshon, Nahshon of Salmon, Salmon of Boaz, Boaz of Obed, Obed of Jesse, and Jesse of David. This is the word of the Lord.
I was just trying to be merciful by leaving the names off the end there, but I'm pretty sure it's because I watched too many cheesy after-school specials in the 80s. Very important episodes of things, right? But buried deep in my soul is the idea that every story should have a moral. You know that point in those cheesy after-school specials, that point at which somebody sits down the kid who was caught smoking in the bathroom or whatever the crisis of the week was, right? And they talk about what they've learned from all of this. What the moral of the story is. Now, of course, not every story has a moral. But Ruth does. This book of Ruth does, in fact, have a pretty clear lesson, a pretty clear moral, and it is this, that this whole story, this tale of how this widow, Naomi, the widow of Elimelech, and her daughter-in-law Ruth, how they returned from Moab to the land of Israel, and how Ruth met and eventually married a kindly farmer named Boaz and had a baby. This story is all about God's providence. It is, and by providence, I mean God's sovereign governance of the universe to bring about His purposes. This whole story of Ruth is really just one big sermon illustration. It's an illustration of the truth that the Apostle Paul wrote in Romans 8:28 when he says that we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to His purpose. You see, it was God who called Naomi and Ruth back to Bethlehem, right? It was God who directed Ruth's steps, who led her to the field of Boaz and not to somebody else. It was God who opened Ruth's heart to this middle-aged farmer. Middle-aged farmers are otherwise not a great catch. But it was God who opened Ruth's heart to Boaz and Boaz's heart to Ruth. Without any fanfare. Without any fanfare, without any angelic trumpets, without any words of prophecy. Because let's be honest, there almost never is any, is there? I mean, 99.999% of life is not lived with voices from heaven and thunder and lightning, the big theophany stuff. 99.999% of life is lived in just quietly. So without any word of prophecy or any voices from heaven, He quietly called these people together according to His purpose, a purpose that's only revealed at the end of the book here, when we learn that Ruth and Boaz had a son named Obed, and Obed had a son named Jesse, and Jesse had a son named David, who would be king of Israel, heir to the covenant promises of God, and the human ancestor through many, many generations of Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior of the world. According to His purpose, He did this. Now here's the thing about Romans 8:28. It's easy for us to say God works all things together for good for those who love Him, who are called according to His purpose. But that's a really dangerous promise if you don't have a little bit of context. In short, should you ever find yourself in a position to minister to somebody who has just lost a husband or a wife or a child or a parent, this ought not to be the first verse out of your tool bag here. Don't walk up, pat them on the shoulder, and say, well, God works all things together for good. Because if you do that, you then have to answer the follow-up question. How? How is God going to use the death of this child for good? And you're not going to have the answer. Because it's not given to us. You do not want to have that conversation. But this is one of the reasons that Ruth is so valuable. This book of Ruth is so valuable here. Because this is all about providence, but the story itself never attempts to. It's all about God working all things together for good. But the story never tries to explain how. It just shows us God at work. Shows us people struggling with ordinary cares and sorrows and joys, and in the end, how God brings great good. And actually, in Jesus Christ, the greatest good out of it. And along the way, we learn a few things about providence that wouldn't be immediately obvious to us from just quoting like Romans 8:28 out of context. The first thing we learn about providence, about God's governance of the world to work all things together, ultimately for good, The first thing we learn about God's providence here is that the ordinary means of God's providence look, well, ordinary. How did God bring this family from Bethlehem, Naomi and Elimelech and Mahlon and Chilion, how did he bring them to Moab so that they could meet Ruth? Well, it wasn't a word of prophecy from on high. It was a famine. It was a drought. It was something that happens actually fairly regularly in that part of the world. How did God bring Naomi and Ruth back to Bethlehem so that Ruth could meet Boaz? There was food there. They had a decent harvest. Normal everyday stuff. I mean, this is not dramatic, right? Normal everyday stuff. And yet these are the means by which the creator of the universe summoned the great-grandmother of David from her home, from among the Gentiles, to be joined to his chosen people. I meet so many people who are waiting for a sign. It actually drives me crazy. I meet so many people who are waiting for God to carve words on the hillside in bolts of lightning to tell them what to do. You know, people who are just not sure. I had a friend years ago. Don't tell him I said this. I won't tell you who he is. I had a friend years ago. He was a sour guy. I don't know why we were friends, but anyway, we had a friend years ago, and we worked together at seminary, and he, this girl, starting the first week of seminary, this girl kept stopping in and asking for him, and eventually I had to break the news to him that she wasn't just looking for directions every day, and every day she didn't just want to use the phone, that this girl is into you. And so they started dating, and they were dating for about a few months, number of months, and he came to me and he said, Andy, I just don't know. She's interested in getting married. I said, you lucky dog, because I've seen her and I've seen you, and you're doing well. And he said, but I'm not sure. I've been praying for a sign from God that this is the person I'm supposed to marry. I said, she's a Christian, right? He said, yeah. I said, she's pretty. He said, yeah. I said, she likes you, wants to marry you. He said, yeah. I said, what do you want? What are you waiting for? I'm not sure what extra sign. The sign that you should marry this girl is that girl is willing to marry you. People looking for a sign. They're looking for word of prophecy, and they're afraid. They're afraid that if they don't receive a sign like that if they don't receive that word of prophecy, that God has somehow not spoken, that he's not at work. But that's not how he normally works. For every Moses and every Elijah, there are 100,000 Boazes who just live lives of simple, quiet obedience, trusting that the Lord is sovereign and in control, no matter what. Who never get a word from on high, but whose steps are no less directed by God. The second thing I mentioned this a couple weeks ago, the second thing that we learn here from the book of Ruth about God's providential governance of the universe to work all things together for good is that sometimes God's providence, at least from a human perspective, can be bittersweet. I mentioned, what was it that brought Naomi and Ruth back to Bethlehem to meet Boaz? Well, it was a grain harvest, but there was another part of it, and that was that 3 men died. I mean, Naomi was widowed. Ruth was widowed. Ruth's sister-in-law, Orpah, was widowed. You think they were cheerful about that, saying, awesome, God's working all things together for good? No. Now, do we know in the end that he was? Yes, because we've read the end of the story. But they didn't have the end of the story. And yes, 3 men had to die for this story to end the way it did. Now, by the way, as a sort of small aside here, those 3 men were Israelites. And that's important here when you're reading the story. They were Israelites. They were members of God's covenant people. They were heirs to the promises of God. And if we can judge by the women that they married, probably reasonably godly guys. People who trusted in the promises of the Lord. Now, mind you, gauging your faith by your wife's faith is not always a very good measure, but in any case, that's the best we've got here. So I think it's even reasonable to hope that Elimelech and Mahlon and Chilion are saved. I think you can hope that without wishful thinking here. That by taking them away from Naomi, the Lord gathered them to himself. Now, that said, again, from a human perspective, that loss is a bitter pill to swallow. Providence sometimes is, especially when we can't see where things are headed. The third thing that we learn about God's providence from the book of Ruth here, it comes through really clearly in the 4th chapter. And it is this, that while the means of providence may often be bittersweet, the paths of providence are routinely steep and twisted with lots of dead ends. Is he working all things together for good for those who love him, for those who are called according to his purpose? Absolutely. Is it one big blissful trek down the highway of life? No. It's more like, you ever drive US 250 from Stanton, Virginia to Elkins, West Virginia? It's the only road, yeah, Gary's all over. The only road I've ever driven on that I had to stop and get out and throw up while I was driving. You know, you never get car sick when you're driving. Sarah had, we were all sick. It was bad. Yeah, I wouldn't ever want to do that road in, fog or the winter or things like that. Life is a little bit more like that, a little bit more like a donkey path up the mountain. And there are false turns, and there are cliffs to the side, and there are dangers at every turn. Plenty of dead ends and cul-de-sacs where you have to turn around. And why is that? Why is God... Look, if God is going to work all things together for good, for me, if I love him, why isn't it just a straight shot to glory? A few reasons. One is that I'm a sinner, and I mess things up all the time. I can mess up frying an egg. I have done. Last week, I was unable to make oatmeal. That was not impressive. Yeah, that's just, the technical stuff. No, yeah, look, I'm a sinner. You're sinners. Look around the room. You see many sinners. Redeemed by grace, absolutely, but sinners. And so, yeah, part of the reason life isn't a straight shot to glory is that we mess things up. Part of the reason life isn't a straight shot to glory is that other people mess things up for us. Part of the reason life isn't a straight shot to glory is that we live in a fallen world where there are wars, where there is cancer, where there is poverty. And part of the reason, a big part of the reason life is not a straight shot to glory is that you have an enemy. That the devil prowls like a lion seeking someone to devour. That his entire reason for being is to get you off track, is to keep you away, is to spoil the game. So we shouldn't be surprised that there are obstacles, that this isn't a straight path to glory. You see this here in Ruth, right? Have a look at, for example, chapter 3, verse, what is it? Like verse 13, 12 or 13. We read this last week. At this point, this is a boy meet girl story, right? And at this point in the story, boy has met girl, and boy liked girl. And girl has met boy, and girl liked boy. She snuck up on him in the middle of the night and snuggled up to his feet, which he correctly understood this as a marriage proposal, so everything was good. And the boy promised the girl that he would do all that you ask, for my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. Now, ordinarily, this is the point where you expect them to get married and live happily forever after. But Boaz drops a bombshell. He's an honest guy, and there's a problem. And the problem is this. It is true that I am a redeemer, but there is a redeemer nearer than I. In other words, there's another man. Now, if you weren't here last week, I pity you. Your life is lesser for it. But I also need to explain what's going on. The law of God, given to Moses, made provision for two things that have to do with this. The first provision was for young childless widows. Remember, this is a society in which there's no Social Security death benefits, there's no pensions, there's no means to support a young woman whose husband has died, who does not have a son, she didn't inherit property, she's on her own, right? So the law of God made provision for this by requiring the nearest male relative of the dead man to marry the widow, and by declaring that the first son born to them would be the legal heir of the dead brother or cousin or whatever he was, so that their property didn't leave the family. And so that she had means of support. The second provision of the law that you need to know about here is the provision of a redeemer. Now, basically, what it boils down to is this, that when land is somehow alienated from a family, maybe it's seized, confiscated, sold, lost in a game of dice, I don't know, however you lose your land, it was the responsibility of the nearest male relative to go and buy it back so that it didn't leave the family. That was also true of people who had to sell themselves into slavery to survive. It was the responsibility of a brother, cousin, uncle to go and to redeem them from slavery, to pay the price to get them out, to free them. What Boaz was telling Ruth here was that there was another man, a man more closely related to her dead husband, who had the right, even the responsibility by law, to marry Ruth and to repurchase Naomi's husband's family land. Now, you talk about a letdown. This is not how love stories are supposed to end. Fortunately, this is not how this story ends. The law, and in case you're interested, you can find this commandment in the 25th chapter of Deuteronomy, beginning in verse 5. The law made a provision in case a guy didn't want to get married to that girl. So, and basically what it boiled down to was it required him to testify in the presence of the town elders, and it involved a ritual humiliation that included pulling his shoe off. I don't know why that's humiliating, but shoes. By the way, that's still the case in the Middle East. You know, do you remember when the guy threw a shoe at George Bush? Yeah, I mean, he wasn't trying to hurt him. That was supposed to be insulting. You know, you hurl your shoe at someone you don't care for. So this was some kind of ritual humiliation involving shoes. And as it turns out, it was that oddity of the law that Boaz used to marry the girl of his dreams here. He sat down at the city gates the next day, where the elders customarily gathered, so he'd have 10 elders to witness. And when his rival approached, Boaz called out to him, and then he did something kind of fun. He didn't mention Naomi, did he? Or Ruth. Excuse me, he didn't mention Ruth. He just said to him, hey, you know what? Naomi's back, and, she's got a field. And he says that she's selling. That's maybe a translation issue. It's not clear what Naomi's relationship to this land was. It may have been something that had been sold out from under her while she was in Moab. It might have been something that she sold, that Elimelech, her husband, sold before they went to Moab. But in any case, Naomi has this land that can be redeemed. And that sounds pretty good to this guy. It's land, maybe at a discount. Awesome. And then Boaz drops the bomb on him. Says, by the way, when you buy this field, you're also acquiring Ruth. You're also, wait, there's more. Not only do you get this field, but you also get a beautiful young foreigner. And that's where the guy balked. And he said, he said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. What did he mean by that? What he meant by that was, this land is going to cost money. It's going to cost a significant chunk of money. And if he marries Ruth, and they have a son, when he dies, that land and that investment goes to the son that he has to Ruth. It's not divided among his other children, which this guy clearly, I think it's pretty clear here, he has other children. And in other words, he'd be shortchanging his own children by doing this. And so he says, no, you know what, I can't do it. So they swap shoes, and Boaz marches off with the bride. And you know the rest of the story. They have a son, and that son has a son, and that son has a son who is David, and on to Christ. Is it true? And sometimes it's hard to believe, right? The promise of Romans 8:28, that God works all things together for good for those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. Yeah, it's true. It's absolutely true. But don't for a second imagine that this is going to be some kind of cakewalk to glory. The means of providence, the methods that he uses to do it, are often things that we don't even think about. They're often quiet little things. They are his ways are sometimes, from our perspective, bittersweet. I mean, men died here. And that path that he leads his people on, that, oh, by the way, even in the book of Ruth, ultimately leads to Jesus, right? That path that he leads his people on is sometimes it's rocky and steep, and there are dead ends, and they got to turn around, there's obstacles, there's boulders in the way. But here's the good news. We don't have to know the map. We don't have to have the map. It's okay. The only thing we have to do is know our guide. The only thing we have to do is trust the one we are following to pick us up when we fall, to point us in the right direction, to drag us along kicking and screaming when we don't want to go. I don't know where the Lord is taking you. All I can tell you is that he's good, and he's trustworthy, and he's true, and in the end, his intention is to lead you to his Son. Amen.